I did not know much about humanism when I became a Unitarian Universalist minister. I had been a Presbyterian minister for 15 years, and I was educated at Presbyterian Seminary called Princeton Seminary in New Jersey. And we didn't learn a lot about humanism there. I learned some about humanism when I was growing up, but it was by hearing grown-ups mutter about the secular humanists and how they were taking over the school system. I just knew that secular humanists were supposed to not think what they did was a religion, but it really was. None of that made a lot of sense. So when I became a Unitarian Universalist minister, I came into a denomination in the 90s that was maybe 50%, 46% I think was the percentage humanist identified. And so I subscribed my church to the Humanist magazine, which is a wonderful publication. And on the front page of the Humanist magazine was a definition that I liked. It said, "Humanism is a philosophy of joyous service for the greater good of all humanity in this natural world, and advocating the methods of reason, science, and democracy." And there was a longer definition about how humanism was inspired by art and compassion, and there were articles in the magazine, interviews with Alice Walker and Aung San Suu Kyi, and lots of people who were wonderful human beings. And there was always a column called Watch on the Right. I think there still is a column called Watch on the Right, and tells what the right-wing religious folks are doing, and what the Southern Poverty Law Center or whatever was doing about what they were doing. I read Kurt Vonnegut's book called Man Without a Country. He talks about being raised humanist by humanist parents. His parents were humanist free thinkers, they were called. And he talked about how most of the humanists in his growing up time were pretty derisive about religion. And to the point that he said when he was doing Isaac Asimov's humanist funeral, the first thing he said, he stood up and he said in his voice, "Well, at least we can all be glad that Isaac is in heaven now." He said it just brought the crowd to its knees. So I read John Dewey's book about humanism from the 30s. I learned about the Humanist Manifesto from 1933, and that many Unitarians had been, they weren't Unitarian Universalists then until 1961. Many Unitarians had been signers and composers of the Humanist Manifesto, and that the humanist movement had really just taken the Unitarian Church by storm, to where almost all of the members of the Unitarian Church were also members of the humanist movement. And they talked about supporting the maximization of human liberty, the extension of participatory democracy, the expansion of the open society, standing for human rights and social justice, being free of supernaturalism and superstition, and that this humanist dream was of having a movement, a system of thought where people could join and be free of all of the hoodoo of religion, not having to believe in any kind of priest or any kind of magic, just common sense, what made sense to you, that was what you were going to believe in. And it was very appealing to many, many Unitarians, to the point where really, as of the early 2000s, there weren't many members in the Humanist Association. They were all members in the Unitarian Church. It's funny to my Christian colleagues when we get to talking about the folks and they say, well, of course, my older folks are so conservative and there are certain things I can't say from the pulpit because of my older folks. And I said, well, in the Unitarian Church, you can't say the word God from the pulpit because of the older folks. that a lot of folks are humanists who are older in the UU movement because they came of age in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s when humanism just was it for Unitarians. It was after the merger with the Universalists that the spiritual stuff started coming back in again because we wanted to honor the other half of our movement, the Universalists, and they were Trinitarian Christians who believed that Jesus was divine, and we were suddenly here together all in one religion, these humanists and these Christians. What are you going to do? They worked out where we're going to have the headquarters, but they didn't work out much of anything else. We did adopt the principles because the Universalists said, we just need something we can say we all believe in. It doesn't have to be a creed, but let's have at least some principles that we say, in general, we agree on these things. So they wrote principles, and they were all in kind of 1960s language, man this and man that. And in 1985, the women of the Unitarian Universalists just said, hey, we'd like to be represented too, please. And so they said, well, write them and we'll vote on them. And so they did. That's the ones we have now. So humanism is a movement of hope, good sense, fresh air, clearing away what people felt was stuffy and rigid and destructive about dogma. So what happens, though, with religious experience? That's the sticking point. One of the presidents of our denomination, Bill Schultz, wrote a book about humanism and how he calls himself a spiritual humanist because he was missing the religion part. Religion comes from the Latin to religio, the ligament, to relink things together, just tie them back together, reconnect. And so what happens with that? How do you scientifically address the religious experiences that so many people have? In the whole Humanist Manifesto, the first one was all about beliefs and intellect and sweeping away superstition. And then as the manifesto began to evolve, they began to put more stuff in there about, of course, we stand in awe in front of nature's beauty and terror. They wanted to make sure the beauty and terror of nature were both in there because a lot of people who think of themselves as nature worshipers or people who say things like, oh, I can't see a sunset and dolphins without believing in God. Then you want to say, yes, those things do make you think of God because they are wonderful. But if you're going to use nature to make you think of God, you've got to stay in nature long enough without going back to your hotel room for drinks. Just stay in nature long enough to notice that it's also terrible. And that if you're going to see God in the dolphins, you have to also see God in the cancer cells. Know what I'm saying? And so it's intellectually a little more challenging than you can't just do the unicorns and rainbows thing. You've got to, not that there are unicorns, the humanists would say, no. Ixnay on the unicorns, yay. But for John Dewey in his book, he talked about the religious attitude was a composing and harmonizing of the various elements of our being that settles and arranges the conditions around us. That harmony of your being. I think that's a great religious humanist idea. Schultz talks about how humanism was such a breath of fresh air and was so energized by the difficulties that the religious right wing had made for any kind of justice work in the United States. For example, Margaret Sanger, whom we talked about last month, had a terrible time with the religious powers of her day because she wanted to keep women from dying by teaching about birth control, and they did not want anyone having birth control. Later on, Joycelyn Elders was fired from her position in the cabinet because she wanted frank talk about AIDS and birth control and sexuality, and that was not okay with the religious right, who wanted to teach that AIDS was prevented by abstinence. And Joycelyn elders said, tell that to the babies in the neonatal intensive care unit who have AIDS, that they should have been abstinent, and then they wouldn't have it. It's ridiculous. So the anger at that kind of control that the religious right used to have over our laws, thank goodness it doesn't happen anymore. The humanists also wanted to wake people up to taking care of this earth and taking care of themselves. And I heard this story in the Presbyterian Church, which also wanted to wake people up into taking care of the earth and taking care of themselves. They said, some people act like that preacher who was in the floodwaters. I'm sure you've heard this story. So he's standing on top of his house in Boulder, Colorado, and the floodwaters are just roaring by his house, and he says, God, save me. And these guys come past in a boat, and they're like, come on, preacher, get in. And the preacher says, no, go on, save somebody else. God's going to save me. And then the floodwaters encroach. Another boat comes along. Preacher, get in. You're going to drown. No, God's going to save me. Then the floodwaters are lapping up at his shoes, and a helicopter comes and hovers and sends a rope and says, preacher, come on, get on the rope and we'll save you. No, God is going to save me. And of course, the floodwaters sweep him away and he drowns. And so he's at the pearly gates of heaven and he says to God, why didn't you save me? And God says, I sent 2 boats and a helicopter. So, and that's a story I heard in Presbyterian youth group about don't count on God to save you like that. And the humanists were reacting against that kind of behavior from believers. They also react against fundamentalism of any stripe. I mean, there are Muslim fundamentalists a news person was in Afghanistan and was walking through abandoned buildings and found a whole building with deflated weather balloons just stacked to the ceilings that had sand all over them. And apparently the Taliban, the fundamentalists, had felt that knowing the weather was against God. So they took all the weather balloons out of commission. So just things like that go on in the mind. And there are fundamentalists of every religion, including Unitarian Universalism and Humanism, I want to say. And the fundamentalists are the ones who just cannot, as the children were going north and going south in the middle of the aisle, cannot budge and will not budge like the people who were talking to Spinoza. They will stay there for 52 years, and you have to build the highway over them because there's a rule here, a principle, and they will not budge. And that is how we get in trouble. So we have this wonderful influence of humanism that continues to evolve. And there's a wonderful comedian named Julia. What is her name? She says, letting go of God is her, Sweeney, Julia Sweeney, thank you. And so you can Google Julia Sweeney, letting go of God, and she talks about her journey from being a good Catholic girl to being an atheist humanist because of just her philosophical journey. So, and she is wonderful talking about it, and it is a great influence on Unitarian Universalism, unless it is in its fundamentalist form, and then it creates great difficulty making people feel shamed if they have a religious experience. And we need to be able to open up our Unitarian Universalist congregations to talking about religious experience, which we'll talk about in another few weeks, because people have experiences like this, and to diminish them and say, oh, it's just something you ate, is not dignifying a person's inner life. The last thing Schultz says about humanism is that it is somewhat lacking in resources for when you're in trouble. He talks about the story about when Pooh was stuck in the doorway of Rabbit's house. You all know Winnie the Pooh. He was somewhat portly, and he got stuck in the doorway of Rabbit's house and made a simple request. Would you be so kind as to read a sustaining book, such as would help and comfort a wedged bear in a great tightness? He says humanism is lacking such a book. The humanists would give him advice on how to get out. He says, they would tell him that you have to just do your best and dance anyway, even when life is difficult. And that is a lot. That is a lot. But a religious community, I think, even a humanist religious community, would gather around Pooh. And we would say, you're not in this by yourself. We'll be in this with you. And we know your name. And we know the name of the person who lives in this house whose door you're stuck in. And we'll sing to you and we'll read to you. We'll play music for you until you get unwedged. And we'll give you advice. But we won't feed you because that's probably some of the problem. But we won't talk about it with you. We'll just be real sweet until you get unstuck. I think humanism is so lucky to have Unitarian Universalism as its companion, because I think together we will evolve into a faith movement where you can have people to go through life with you to help you face, as we said last week, the full catastrophe, and to sing to you, to speak with you, to live their lives alongside yours, and wonder together about the mystery. I will look forward to hearing what you have to say.